Hi, I'm Carol Owens, and this is Stockbridge Updates. Today, we're going to talk about housing, because everybody is. I wrote at least one column for the Berkshire Eagle, and Peter Most and I wrote a joint column on the need for affordable housing for the Berkshire Edge. That was kind of interesting. I took the position that I wasn't sure why taxpayers and property owners were being cut out of the process under the new Commonwealth Affordable Homes Act about where affordable housing would be or where it would be placed. A million little local decisions were taken out of the hands of the locals and given to the state. Peter took the position, much more expedient position, that we need affordable housing right now. And by moving control away from the locality and into the hands of the state, it would happen faster. And that was an important variable. I think initially most people agreed with Peter, I must say, but I refer them to Lee, Massachusetts, where they have the same problem with the PCB removal from the Houstonic River and deposit into a local, well, it's a dump, guys. So removal of the PCBs from here and placed in a dump in Lee there. And the locals are really chafing that they don't have more control over how that whole process goes. But back to housing. I also spoke to Steve Bannon, who's the chair of the select board in Great Barrington, and both Stockbridge, this is after all Stockbridge Updates, and Great Barrington have met the state quota for the percentage of housing units in a municipality that must be in the affordable category. We have that in Stockbridge, and Steve Bannon was saying that they certainly have that in Great Barrington as well. The problem, or the remaining issue, is that the quota doesn't actually translate to enough housing. And we seem to have a very pressing demand for more and still more affordable housing. In Stockbridge this week, I'm speaking to you on January 30th, and in Stockbridge this week, Hal Colbrin, who owns a 10,000 square foot building on the corner of Pine Street and Shamrock, which building is for sale, met with the vice chair of the Affordable Housing Trust, Jan Ackerman, by telephone, the executive director, Andrea Lindsay, in person. She's executive director of the Stockbridge Housing Authority, which runs Heaton Court right across the street from Mr. Colbrin's property, and another member of the Affordable Housing Trust, Patrick White, and they met this week. And I'm not privy. This was not a public meeting, an open meeting, but so I'm not privy to all the conversation. But Mr. Colbrin told me that he's certainly open. The building is for sale, and he's certainly open to the town purchasing. So that could be increase the number of units of affordable housing by perhaps 10 or 11, and it's ideal. It has off-street parking, it has sewer, it has town water. They've done the initial plan at the behest of the Affordable Housing Trust. The first step was $2,000 for an architect to take a look and see how many units it could be divided into. Then there's an additional $10,500 in expenditure for the architect to continue and solve more granular problems about how the building could be worked and what that might cost. as I said, the location is ideal. The price tag is $2.2 million, and currently, to the best of my knowledge, the Affordable Housing Trust has about $200,000. So I think what they're working out is the financing. You know, buildings have been very, very important to me for about 40 years. 40 years ago, I wrote a book called The Berkshire Cottages, and all I could do with respect to those 19th century, absolutely gorgeous houses was preserve them in words on paper. But here's the fun part. I have a guest today and his wife, who I believe work together. They're going to tell us all about it. David and Wende Carver, and they are doing it in 3 dimensions in real life. They're going through our Berkshire County and saving historic buildings. And it's so much fun to welcome both of you. And I want to start by asking you, how did you get going on the notion of saving instead of tearing down old buildings?
Well, we moved back to Williamstown in 1980 after being in school, and I was in the Navy for 4 years. And my background is civil engineering and building, and it's exactly what I did when I was in the military. And Wende grew up in Williamstown. And so when we decided to relocate back to Williamstown, Wendy's dad, Scarfoni, which people in Lee know the name very well, he had started in the car business but had begun a small real estate enterprise. And my role was to manage that enterprise and build it into a business up and down the county. So since 1980, that's exactly what I've been doing. Along the way, I became very interested and passionate about buying older downtown buildings and repurposing them or renovating them or holding them long-term for investment. We started that in North Adams, and we have been slowly drifting to Pittsfield and South County over the last 40 years.
Now, Wende, do you share the passion?
I share it when I listen to how he talks about the buildings, and I learn a lot from him. He talks about the foundations and what you can save and what you can't save. And then I admire what he does. I go in and I see how he leaves as much of the original building as he can and makes it even more beautiful. And I just admire him. So I admire everything he does.
Isn't that marvelous?
Yeah. I really enjoy being a part of it. He runs things past me. We talk about it. He draws. He's always drawing. I think he's a frustrated architect, I believe. So he actually draws it all out. And also, from the very first one that he did, we did a hospital in Adams. And I walked into this building and I went, I can't even imagine. He walks into the building and he sees it completely finished. It's completely done in his mind. He knows where he's going to put this, where he's going to put that. And I just think that that's amazing. And it always looks exactly the way he's pictured it from the minute he walked into the building.
I have to ask you, as someone who's not just expert and trained, but also has had experience, I've tried to save a lot of historic buildings over the years. And I've been successful sometimes. And when I've failed, it's been because I cannot convince people that it's economically feasible. They say, oh, too expensive, exorbitant for it to meet code. You can't get those materials anymore. We haven't trained the craftsmen. It's much more efficient to tear the darn thing down, build new to code. You'll be much happier. Now, what I would like to know from you is when you're walking through a building like that, as Wende just shared with us, what do you look for to see if it's savable?
Well, the first thing we look at is the structure. And we found that most buildings built after 1900 have concrete foundations. In addition to that, we fall in love with the architecture. We don't build and design like they used to build in the Gilded Age and up through World War II. And I'm just passionate about the architecture And I don't see any reason why most of these buildings cannot be saved. We can't save every one. There are some that were not built to stand the test of time. They're structurally deficient, or there's something wrong with the site. But we have many, many buildings in Berkshire County that have been saved and are still available to be saved. And I think our default position in our community should be we should save these buildings. That should first, if we can't save every one, but that should be our default position.
So the goal is always to save.
Always.
Well, I'm professionally, I was a doctor when I retired. I did my my hobby, my favorite thing, which is history. And as a historian, I really believe the buildings are the repository of our memories, and everyone has done it. You've taken a friend or a child or a grandchild and said, that's where I went to high school. There's the house I grew up in. That's where my best friend lived. You know, that's where I drove the car into the ditch and broke the axle. But we begin with location, and we begin with the building, and I honestly feel if saving the buildings isn't the default position, as you suggest, I think there's a rent in the fabric of our history. But I want to ask you something, because you and I share a kind of passion for a building that had to be torn down, that was on the Shakespeare and Company property, one of the many buildings that was on that property. What was the clincher? What was the thing that just said, cannot be done?
Well, I did look at that old farmhouse building for about a year and a half, on and off. Again, my default position was, no, we need to save this building. It has been slated for demolition for many, many years. But I said, let's not give up quite yet. But on that particular building, in the end, the foundation, 3/4 of it had collapsed. And there were holes in the roof, and the ridge line was sagging, and there was a lot of rot on the inside. So could it have been saved? Sure, we could have photographed it and basically built the same building. It would not have been the original building because so much of it was gone. But we did try for about a year and a half. There is another one on the property that was almost as bad, but not quite. And I said, this one we're going to save. It's an academic exercise. It makes no financial sense, but when the building is done, it will look like the original farmhouse.
And so much of what you save is quite large. It's churches, it's 19th century houses, which were way larger than what we live in now, between 7 and 20,000 square feet, where today we live more in between 11 and 2,500 square feet as a sort of...
Yes.
Yeah. And so they're much bigger houses, and you've converted them for housing.
We have one of the big houses that we converted was on the Fox Hollow property, which was the Vanderbilt property, which had a name called Homewood, and it was about a 25,000 square foot home.
Yeah.
And we acquired it about 7 or 8 years ago. We were thinking about tearing it down because of the obsolescence involved in the building. And at the 11th hour, I said, no, that's not what we do. We save buildings. So we figured out a way to save the building. We did partial demolition, but the main building itself has been saved, and we've turned it into 11 very nice market rate apartments on the high point of the property, and it's been very well received by the residents.
Is it possible to take these buildings, the historic ones, turn them into apartment buildings, as you do, and make them affordable, or have a number of affordable units?
The way to do that, the cost is in Berkshire County today, to build a nice apartment, whether it's new or carved out of an old building, the costs are about the same. It's roughly $300,000 an apartment. So that makes it very difficult to make the numbers work. When you're talking about affordable housing that's government supported, the government fills that gap and it makes the numbers work. And so that may be an appropriate method of financing in some cases. In other cases, specifically in Berkshire County, Pittsfield is a gateway city. And because they are a gateway city, they have a number of programs available to close that gap for not government subsidized housing, but market rate housing, because we need both. We need middle income housing, and we need affordable housing as well. We need both. And I think there are a lot of, since in the last 20, 30 years, there have been a lot of affordable housing complexes built, more on the way. And I think the market rate housing has not kept pace. And I think we do need to do both. But I think our emphasis in the last 10 years has been on trying to figure out how to renovate these older buildings, whether it's a church or a school or a hospital, into market rate housing.
Let me check your terms. Okay, now there's affordable housing. That's in price, low end. That is subsidized. I think affordable housing means that it's subsidized.
Well, affordable housing is a meaningless term unless you define the income levels that you're trying to serve with that project. It's a meaningless term.
Right. It's a percent of AMI. So the definition of affordable housing is that someone whose income is in this realm could reasonably afford it. But here's what I'm trying to get at. We have no dearth of people for housing, which is way expensive. There seems to be a never-ending line of folks that are willing to build $5 million houses on one of our lakes. And at the other end, we have built affordable housing, and Stockbridge has met its quota, and Great Barrington has, and all the towns are rapidly catching up.
Most towns are there.
Most towns
The major towns are there.
I agree. So there are 32 municipalities in Berkshire County, and most of them have reached that level. Now, there's something in the middle, which I call workforce housing. And what I'm asking you is that the same thing you call market housing? Are we talking about the same thing? And that is the group in the middle who don't qualify for any assistance in getting housing.
I simply refer to that as market rate housing.
And so we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, because again, you have to define the terms,
right,
and then proceed with the conversation. But in many ways, workforce housing, affordable housing, typically those are associated with some form of government financing. And if they are associated with some form of government financing, it's usually subsidized. Yeah. And there are income requirements to reside there. What I'm talking about is strictly market rate housing that is financed privately or financed in such a way that there are no income restrictions.
What about St. Raphael's? What was that considered in Williamstown? Because that was middle income, if I understand.
It was
correctly.
It's a hybrid that, because we accepted CPA funds for that church conversion project, we negotiated a level of 100% AMI, I believe, for that particular project, because if you accept government funds, then there's usually a caveat on income levels that are required.
And then somewhere in that whole thing, which worries so many people and is a problem in their lives, is that there's an income level at which or below which there's assistance. And there may be many different kinds of assistance. There's the high end, where those folks don't need any assistance. They can afford to pay for what they wish to have. And then there's a gap in the middle, where prices are rising so quickly that it's outstripping their ability to pay the rent or buy a home. But their income is such that they don't have any assistance. That's what I'm calling workforce, and I think it's kind of what you're calling market
rate housing.
Right, and there are ways, and CPC is one way.
Yes, the CPA, yes. Yeah. So outside of Pittsfield, the towns do have other tools they can use. They have the CPA. They also have TIF programs that they can use to lower the taxes.
Okay, I'm just going to stop you to please. CPA is the
Community Preservation
Act. I refer to it as CPC because I am on the Community Preservation Committee, which does the work of the Community Preservation Act. TIF is
tax increment financing.
Right.
So the communities have the option to lower the taxes to allow the developer and the owner to lower the rents to make the numbers work, as we say.
right. And concomitantly, there is the residential tax exemption where folks, under certain circumstances, can have their property tax lowered, so that that's not an obstacle in staying
Right.
in their homes. All right, so very near to my heart is the Ventford Hall Carriage House. Marcy Brown, Tiasha Sprague, and I worked initially. We walked in that house. We stood on the periphery of the dining room and looked up, and there was a hole in the roof way larger than this table from the fourth floor to the basement. We could just stand there and look up.
I've seen that condition many times.
Yeah, and everything along that continuum was destroyed. And in addition, there had been some vandalism, probably kids, maybe, I don't know, who had come in and thrown hammers and objects at the decorative work in the ceiling, on the rails of stairs, wherever, made mayhem. And there we stood, and we were going to save it by gumbo. And now, these many years later, we did, and Marcy Brown is gone, bless her heart, and Tiasha's still here, and God bless Tiasha Sprague. She is a force of nature. And so it's saved, and now they're in their second reincarnation of saving it some more. But the poor carriage house sits there, and architecturally, I would make a very strong argument that it's equally as beautiful as that house, and should be saved. And I know you haven't walked it yet, but from the outside, from the position, did you think anything?
I can see that it's beautifully designed. Structurally, it looks good. It looks like it's the same architecture that matches the main manor house.
Absolutely.
And I am anxious to take a look on the inside to see what it looks like.
Okay, and that architectural firm was Roach and Tilden, which arguably was one of the best educated of the 19th century architectural firms. There are others that may be more highly valued for different reasons. And they also, Roach particularly, contributed the most toward the establishment of architecture as a profession in our country, establishing or helping to establish the first two schools of architecture. The first was at MIT and the second was at Harvard. And he was not only involved in those two things, but also in awarding the first, the Benjamin Roach Scholarship for the continuing education of an aspiring architect. His work, especially on that site, is beautifully done, and I wish you good luck in saving it.
I'm anxious to see the inside, but it certainly looks like it's savable. The issue is what is the use? What would the zoning allow? What would the neighborhood be comfortable with? What would Ventford Hall be comfortable with? Perhaps a housing is an option there. How many units? And then there's always the gap when you put the numbers on the project. How do you make the numbers work?
It's the second time we referred to numbers, and I mentioned the 10,000 square foot building on Pine and Shamrock in Stockbridge, and it is for sale. Buy and save that. I encourage you. But the thing that surprises me is that I was hearing a number of $600 a square foot for new construction in Stockbridge. Is that, because I heard you say 300 in Pittsfield.
What I was referring to was the total development cost for building a nice two-bedroom apartment, which is about $300,000 per apartment.
Right, but how much a square foot?
Square foot is probably 250 to 300. 600 would be very, very high.
Yeah, see,
some people could spend it if there was a certain detailing inside they wanted on a very expensive high-end home, but it's certainly not necessary. And we spend a lot of time rolling up our sleeves doing what we call value engineering. On a first pass, it might be very expensive. If we work on it, we can probably get that down 15, 20, 30% sometime. It's hard work. It's hard work, but it can be done.
Well, it's been so delightful having both of you, and I personally thank you as someone who always wants to save historic buildings for the work you do. And I also want to officially invite you to write a little article for Stockbridge Updates focusing on cost per square foot and the things that affects that. Because if you want affordable housing, you better understand the cost per square foot in addition to the many other things that are necessary to understand. And here's an expert. And I hope you will do that for me. And thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.